Let's start with a statement most men won't want to hear. Most men are emotionally blind in their relationships, and that blindness is costing them respect, influence, and even self-respect. It's uncomfortable, it's controversial, but it's true. And the harshest part? This isn't about women being deceptive or cruel. It's about understanding human behavior without the rose-colored glasses society wants you to wear. Here's the reality. Relationships are not built solely on love, good intentions, or loyalty. They're built on perception, influence, and psychological dynamics. The problem is that most men are taught to focus on effort rather than outcomes. They believe being nice, consistent, or transparent will automatically earn respect, affection, or trust. But in reality, people respond to influence, not intention. And when influence is wielded subtly, it can manipulate, control, or exploit without anyone ever raising their voice. Emotional manipulation is a silent epidemic in modern relationships. It's quiet, invisible, and often disguised as care, concern, or love. You think you're making the right choices, compromising, and being patient. But sometimes those very actions are exactly what allow manipulation to thrive. The more you give without boundaries, the more control someone else quietly gains over your emotions, decisions, and even your self-worth. Here's the controversial truth. Most men don't recognize manipulation until it's too late, because they confuse emotional pressure for normal relationship dynamics. Feeling guilty for taking time for yourself, questioning every decision because of subtle criticism, tolerating behavior that quietly drains you. These are all classic patterns of emotional influence, and yet they are normalized in our culture. Men are told that compromise is virtue, endurance is strength, and caring more proves love. But in many cases, those virtues are just levers that someone else is using to control your behavior. Now, let's make this relatable. Think about the times you felt drained in a relationship, the moments when you thought you were being fair, patient, or understanding, yet somehow tension or disappointment followed. You would just apologize or give more, not because you were wrong, but because emotional pressure made you feel obligated. Over time, you start doubting yourself, questioning your decisions, and measuring your worth against someone else's approval. That is emotional manipulation in its most insidious form. Here's what's really controversial. Being manipulated is not always obvious, and often looks like being a good partner. The very quality society praises in men, patience, loyalty, consistency, and care, can be exploited by someone skilled in emotional influence. You think you're doing everything right, yet you find yourself frustrated, drained, and undervalued. Why? Because manipulation doesn't operate openly. It operates subtly, targeting patterns of behavior, reliance on approval, and willingness to tolerate discomfort. And here's where most men make the biggest mistake. They assume manipulation is a conscious act of cruelty. It rarely is. Emotional influence often works quietly, relying on your own tendencies against you. When you comply out of guilt, obligation, or desire to avoid conflict, the manipulator doesn't need to fight. They don't need to raise their voice or issue ultimatums. Your compliance is enough to give them control. This is why understanding the psychology behind these dynamics is crucial. Awareness is not cynicism, it's clarity. Recognizing the signs of emotional manipulation allows you to reclaim your energy, protect your boundaries, and make decisions deliberately rather than reactively. It doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means observing patterns, understanding influence, and refusing to surrender your autonomy to subtle pressure. Here's a hard truth many men refuse to face. If you feel trapped, guilty, or emotionally drained in your relationship, it's not always the fault of the other person. It's often the fault of allowing patterns of control to persist. Yes, responsibility is uncomfortable to acknowledge. Yes, it challenges the belief that being good, patient, or loyal is always rewarded. But the moment you recognize these patterns, you gain power. The moment you see how influence operates, you can respond intentionally instead of unconsciously. Throughout this video, we'll break down the most critical signs of emotional manipulation, the patterns most men miss, the subtle cues that quietly control behavior, and the psychological triggers that exploit loyalty, care, and patience. You'll learn not to act like someone else's puppet, not because you're selfish, but because being unaware is far more dangerous than being deliberate. If there's one takeaway from this introduction, let it be this. Relationships are not just about intentions, words, or effort. They are about perception, influence, and the choices you make in response to subtle emotional pressure. Understanding this is not easy. It's uncomfortable. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Most men never see it, and that's why they lose influence, energy, and respect quietly over time. By the end of this video, you'll start to recognize the invisible dynamics at play. See how patterns of manipulation operate in real time and begin reclaiming control over your emotions, decisions, and autonomy. Awareness is the first step. Deliberate action comes next. And the truth is, the moment you understand these dynamics, nothing in a relationship will feel the same. And that's exactly the point. 1. Guilt trips are the silent weapon. One of the most common and subtle ways someone exerts control in a relationship is through guilt. And here's the harsh truth most men refuse to face. Guilt is a weapon, even when it feels like care. Emotional manipulators know how to make you feel responsible for their feelings, their mood, or their happiness. And when you respond, you unknowingly hand over power, not through argument, force, or even confrontation, but simply through compliance. Think about this. How often have you done something you didn't want to do? Stayed late, changed plans, or ignored your own priorities because someone made you feel guilty if you didn't? Maybe it was a partner hinting that, if you really cared, you'd do this, or I'm hurt that you don't notice how much I've done for you. The statements might feel subtle, polite, or even loving, but the underlying effect is always the same. You feel obligated, and your choices are no longer fully your own. Guilt is powerful because it doesn't require aggression. You comply because you want to avoid discomfort, rejection, or perceived failure. Emotional manipulators rely on this instinct in men. They know most men are wired to solve problems, maintain harmony, and avoid conflict. When guilt is applied strategically, it taps into these instincts and redirects your energy towards satisfying someone else's emotional agenda, often at the expense of your own autonomy. Here's where most men get it wrong. They assume that feeling guilty means they aren't wrong. They overthink, apologize, and bend over backward to fix things that don't need fixing. But guilt in these situations is rarely a reflection of your mistakes. It's a reflection of influence. It's designed to steer your behavior, manipulate your choices, and create dependence on your compliance. In other words, it's emotional blackmail disguised as care or concern. Let's make it relatable. Imagine you plan a night out with friends after a long week. You're looking forward to unwinding. Then your partner says something like, I guess I'll just stay home alone again, since you never put me first. That sentence is short, subtle, and almost casual. Yet the emotional weight is heavy. You feel torn. You start questioning whether your plans are selfish. You may cancel your night or adjust your actions, not because it's what you want, but because you feel guilty. In that moment, your autonomy is compromised, your attention, time, and energy have been redirected by subtle pressure. The more these patterns repeat, the stronger the effect. Over time, you start to anticipate guilt before it's even applied. You preemptively adjust your behavior, prioritizing someone else's emotional agenda over your own. This is exactly what emotional manipulators want. They don't need to argue, threaten, or demand compliance. They simply rely on your internalized response to guilt, and it becomes a powerful tool of control. Here's the controversial insight. Being a nice or accommodating partner often makes men more susceptible to guilt-based manipulation. Society teaches men that patience, loyalty, and understanding are virtues. But manipulators exploit these virtues. When you bend, compromise, and absorb emotional pressure, it's interpreted as weakness, not kindness. And the cycle continues. You tolerate. They apply guilt, you comply, and influence grows. Awareness is the key. The moment you recognize guilt as a tool rather than a reflection of your character, your power returns. You can pause, evaluate, and choose your response deliberately. You don't have to react automatically. You don't have to feel obligated to comply with every subtle hint, comment, or emotional cue. Recognizing that guilt is a tool of influence allows you to reclaim decision-making power and protect your autonomy. Another critical point, guilt often operates alongside other manipulative tactics. It's rarely used in isolation. It works with emotional withdrawal, passive criticism, and conditional affection to create a web of subtle control. Men often don't see the connection until they feel drained, frustrated, or confused about their own choices. That's why awareness and reflection are crucial. The moment you identify these patterns, you can begin separating influence from manipulation, responsibility from coercion, and care from control. Finally, here's a practical insight to internalize. You cannot eliminate guilt, but you can control how it affects you. Recognize when it's being applied strategically rather than fairly. Pause before reacting. Ask yourself whether the expectation aligns with your boundaries, priorities, and values. Choose deliberately rather than defaulting to compliance. Over time, this builds resilience, clarity, and independence, all qualities that reduce susceptibility to emotional manipulation. In relationships, guilt is everywhere, subtle, and often disguised as care. It's not about malice. It's about influence. The moment you start seeing guilt as a lever of control rather than a reflection of your moral failing, you take the first major step toward reclaiming autonomy, protecting your energy, and navigating relationships with clarity, confidence, and self-respect. 2. Silent pressure and emotional withholding. Another key sign of emotional manipulation in relationships is silent pressure and the subtle withdrawal of attention, affection, or approval. Unlike overt arguments or visible conflict, this form of influence operates quietly, almost invisibly. It's not about yelling, threatening, or forcing. It's about creating tension without speaking. And most men don't notice it until it has already affected their emotions, decisions, and energy. The difficult truth is that many men underestimate how powerful this silent form of influence can be. Men are socialized to prioritize action, problem-solving, and responsibility. When someone withholds attention or approval, the natural response is to fix it or seek reassurance. You start second-guessing yourself, replaying interactions in your head, and try to anticipate what will restore harmony. Over time, this creates a subtle but constant internal pressure that guides your behavior, often without your conscious awareness. You can probably relate. The feeling of walking on eggshells, trying not to upset someone, or carefully monitoring how your words and actions will be received. That tension isn't a sign of weakness. It's a signal that influence is at work. Emotional manipulators rely on this instinct in men. They understand that pressure doesn't have to be loud or aggressive. It only has to be consistent, subtle, and psychologically uncomfortable. That discomfort is enough to shape choices and priorities without confrontation. The key issue is that this form of manipulation often tricks men into overthinking, overcompensating, or overcommitting. You may notice that your thoughts revolve around pleasing the other person, adjusting behavior, or predicting reactions. Your energy begins to feel drained, your confidence dips, and your autonomy slowly erodes. And yet, it's subtle. There's no explicit demand, no threat, no visible pressure. That's why many men fail to identify it as manipulation at all. Here's where the controversy lies. Men are often complicit in their own manipulation. By seeking approval, prioritizing others' feelings over their own, or avoiding conflict, they create the conditions for influence to take hold. The very traits that society praises, patience, loyalty, empathy, become tools in the hands of someone skilled at subtle control. It's uncomfortable to admit, but sometimes your compliance is exactly what allows influence to persist. This silent pressure doesn't just affect behavior. It affects perception. You begin to question your judgment, doubt your instincts, and feel uncertain about your worth. Decisions you once made confidently are now filtered through the lens of how they will be received. Boundaries you once maintained start to blur. Over time, this quiet manipulation becomes a pattern. Your choices, priorities, and even emotions are subtly guided by someone else's control, while you unconsciously take responsibility for maintaining the dynamic. It's also critical to understand that this is not about overt conflict. Emotional manipulators often avoid confrontation because subtle pressure is more effective. Men are conditioned to respond to conflict with solutions, reassurance, or compromise. By avoiding loud arguments and using silence, withdrawal, or indirect cues, influence is applied without giving the impression of coercion. It's quiet, invisible, and difficult to resist because it targets your natural instincts to maintain harmony, connection, and responsibility. Relatability is key here. Many men feel drained, anxious, or unsure in relationships but cannot identify the source. The tension, the unease, and the pressure feel like personal failure rather than an external dynamic. That's exactly why recognizing these patterns is essential. Awareness is a first step toward reclaiming energy, confidence, and autonomy. Once you see the subtle signals of influence, you can respond deliberately instead of reacting unconsciously. Finally, the most important insight is this. You cannot control the other person's behavior, but you can control your response. Recognizing silent pressure doesn't require confrontation, blame, or anger. It requires awareness, reflection, and deliberate boundaries. Understanding these dynamics allows men to make decisions with clarity, protect their energy, and resist being subtly guided by someone else's emotional agenda. In short, silent pressure and emotional withholding are signs that influence is at work in your relationship. Men often overlook them because they are quiet, subtle, and psychologically uncomfortable. But the moment you notice the tension, understand the pattern, and choose your response intentionally, your power begins to return. Emotional influence thrives in unawareness. Awareness neutralizes it. 3. Your tolerance is their leverage. Wake up. Here's a hard truth that most men refuse to face. Your tolerance often gives manipulators the power to control you. Yes, your patience, your endurance, and your willingness to go along are exactly what allows subtle influence to flourish. It's uncomfortable, controversial, and the kind of insight most self-help advice never addresses. But it's crucial if you want to reclaim your autonomy in relationships. Too many men believe that enduring emotional pressure, subtle criticism, or constant tension proves strength. They think patience equals virtue. They think being understanding or flexible will automatically earn respect or loyalty. The reality? The more you tolerate, the more control someone else quietly gains over your choices, your emotions, and your priorities. Think about it. When you let small things slide, a subtle guilt trip, a passive-aggressive comment, or an expectation that drains your energy, you are sending a signal. That signal says, I am available, my energy is at your disposal, and I will not enforce my boundaries. Over time, these repeated signals teach manipulators exactly how far they can push, how much they can demand, and how little resistance they will encounter. And the worst part? Most men don't even realize they are sending these signals. They believe tolerance is strength, when in reality, it's the opposite. Here's where criticism comes in. Too many men are asleep in their own lives. They tolerate patterns that drain them, justify behavior that undermines them, and assume effort alone will create respect or influence. They over-explain themselves, overcompensate, and overcommit, all in an attempt to keep the peace or be the good partner. But let's be honest. Being good does not automatically command respect. Being accommodating does not automatically prevent manipulation. And being patient does not automatically earn loyalty. In fact, excessive tolerance often makes men more susceptible to emotional control. Waking up begins with awareness. You need to recognize that your compliance can be a tool for someone else's leverage. The moment you understand that tolerance has a cost, you begin to see relationships differently. You start to notice patterns instead of ignoring them. You start to question why your energy feels drained and your decisions feel compromised. And most importantly, you start to realize that your autonomy and self-respect are more valuable than avoiding temporary discomfort. This is not about being rigid, aggressive, or cold. It's about clarity and self-governance. Assert your boundaries calmly and consistently. Stop bending to emotional pressure simply to keep the peace. Stop rationalizing behavior that undermines your confidence and energy. Understand that influence thrives when men remain unaware, passive, or overly accommodating. By refusing to give away control unconsciously, you reclaim authority over your own life. Here's a controversial but necessary insight. Men often lose themselves in relationships because they confuse tolerance with maturity. They assume that enduring discomfort is a sign of strength, when in reality, it's a form of self-betrayal. By tolerating subtle manipulation, men give away their power, silently erode their confidence, and allow influence to dictate their choices. The moment they recognize this, it's both liberating and shocking, because most men have never been taught to identify these patterns. Relatable? Consider the times you've adjusted your schedule, energy, or priorities repeatedly for someone else, even when it drained you. Think about the moments when you tolerated criticism, guilt, or subtle emotional pressure because you wanted to avoid conflict. Those are the exact moments when influence grows quietly. If you reflect honestly, you'll probably realize it's happening more often than you want to admit. Here's the advice every man needs to hear. Stop being unconscious in your relationships. Stop tolerating behaviors that compromise your energy and autonomy. Stop believing that patience alone is strength. Observe patterns, recognize influence, and respond deliberately. Enforce your boundaries consistently. Value your time, your decisions, and your emotional energy. When you start doing this, manipulators can no longer operate invisibly. Their leverage diminishes and your self-respect grows. The wake-up call is simple but powerful. If you continue tolerating subtle control, you'll continue to lose influence, energy, and clarity. But the moment you recognize your own role in allowing influence, the entire dynamic changes. Awareness is a first step, action is a second, and consistency is the key. Being deliberate in your responses doesn't make you cold. It makes you strong, grounded, and in control. In short, men need to stop confusing tolerance with strength, patience with virtue, and compliance with loyalty. Your boundaries, your autonomy, and your emotional energy are your most valuable assets. Protect them. Observe influence carefully. And remember, subtle control only works when you allow it. Wake up, see the patterns, and reclaim your power. Here's the part most men won't want to hear, but it's a truth you need to face. If you're feeling drained, anxious, or undervalued in your relationships, it's rarely because of someone else's mistreatment alone. It's because you allowed patterns of influence to control your life without realizing it. This isn't a blame game. It's not about pointing fingers at women, partners, or even specific situations. The uncomfortable truth is that most men unconsciously hand over their emotional energy, autonomy, and decision-making power, and then wonder why they feel trapped, frustrated, or powerless. Yes, it's controversial. It challenges everything society teaches men about relationships. We are told that being loyal, patient, and understanding is always rewarded. We are told that compromise is virtue, endurance is strength, and over-explaining or giving too much is proof of character. But emotional influence operates on a different logic. Compliance, tolerance, and over-accommodation are exactly what manipulators exploit. When you prioritize someone else's feelings, moods, or expectations above your own boundaries, you are quietly surrendering influence. And the worst part? You may not even notice it until the frustration, confusion, and resentment have built up. Let's be clear, this is not about becoming cold, detached, or controlling. It's about reclaiming clarity, autonomy, and respect. From yourself first, you need to see the subtle dynamics that have been shaping your choices and energy. You need to stop interpreting emotional pressure as guilt for being insufficient or selfish. You need to stop letting patterns of manipulation dictate your behavior under the guise of care or love. Here's the wake-up call. Many men are the architects of their own emotional exploitation. By tolerating pressure, by over-explaining, by compromising too much, and by ignoring the subtle cues of influence, you're training others, whether consciously or unconsciously, on how far they can push. And make no mistake, people notice patterns. They respond to what is allowed, not what is said. Your energy, boundaries, and presence are signals, and manipulators pay attention to them. This is why awareness is the ultimate form of power. The moment you recognize the patterns, the subtle nudges, and the quiet manipulations, your perspective shifts. You start to understand that influence thrives in unawareness. You begin to see how compliance, patience, and over-accommodation, all of which society praises, can actually make you more vulnerable to subtle control. And the moment you choose to act deliberately, assert boundaries, and protect your energy, the dynamic changes immediately. Now, here's the truly controversial part. Being nice or overly accommodating does not guarantee love, loyalty, or respect. It often guarantees influence over you without your consent. That's not a moral judgment. It's a psychological fact. Effort without boundaries does not create attraction, connection, or respect. It creates dependence, obligation, and opportunity for influence. And most men never see it coming, because they've been taught that caring, patience, and endurance are always virtuous. But here's the upside. Once you recognize the subtle manipulations, once you understand invisible levers of influence, you gain control over your own life and choices. You start to act deliberately rather than react unconsciously. You stop over-accommodating. You stop tolerating patterns that drain you. You start setting boundaries that protect your energy and self-respect. And when that happens, not only does your autonomy return, but your relationships shift, because you are no longer a passive participant in someone else's emotional agenda. I want to hear from you. I want you to reflect honestly. Have you ever felt emotionally drained, frustrated, or anxious in your relationships without knowing exactly why? Have you noticed yourself bending, compromising, or over-explaining to maintain peace or approval? Share your experiences in the comments. Don't just write them down to vent. Reflect. Analyze the patterns. I read every comment, and when I can, I reach out personally. This channel isn't about preaching from above. It's about building awareness, understanding patterns, and learning together. Your experiences are data points. They are opportunities to see what's working, what's draining you, and what subtle influences are at play. Every story shared, every reflection made, strengthens your understanding of human behavior and emotional dynamics. And more importantly, it helps you take deliberate action in your life. So, take a moment and ask yourself, how much of your energy, time, and emotion have you been unconsciously giving away? How often have you tolerated influence under the guise of being nice or patient? The answer may be uncomfortable, but discomfort is the first sign that something important has landed. Awareness is always uncomfortable at first, and that's why most men avoid it. But avoidance only strengthens the very dynamics that drain you. The bottom line is this. Stop confusing tolerance with strength, compliance with virtue, and effort with influence over others. Protect your boundaries. Protect your energy. Observe the patterns. And start acting deliberately. Because the moment you understand the psychology at play, you no longer need to react unconsciously. You can act intentionally, reclaiming control, self-respect, and clarity in every relationship. Remember, this isn't theoretical. It's lived experience. And your story matters. Comment below, share what you've noticed, and let's start building awareness together. The moment you stop being blind to emotional influence is the moment your power returns, and the moment your relationships start to operate differently on your terms.